they go and collect the bodies and tend to the wounded. And in this earliest phase in Tolstoy's reckoning with the humanization of war, he inveighs against it in a vague way, but identifying what he sees as the hypocrisy in pausing a war in the name of Christianity and humanity, only to resume the bloodletting shortly after. You might think, he writes, that these men, Christians, who recognize the same great law of love, once they go out from the walls of Sevastopol, will repent of what they've done. Not a bit of it. The white cloth will be put away, and the engines of death and suffering will start their whistling. And once again, the blood of the innocent will flow, and the air will be filled with their groans and cursing. Well, this was just an intimation of his later criticisms of the attempt to make humane, something humane out of war before there were international lawyers who really existed, let alone had connived with states to make a law governing war. The next stage, one of the two I really want to dwell on, comes briefly in War and Peace. By this point, the Swiss gentleman, Henri Dunant, had witnessed a battlefield in the Austro-Sardinian War, the battlefield of Solferino, where famously he saw that the states had not, the generals had not taken care of their men bleeding out and dead strewn around, and convinced European powers to come together to make the first Geneva Convention of 1864, which allowed the new Red Cross to tend to the wounded when states failed to do so. It was the first act of the attempted use of treaty to make war more humane, which lives on into our own time in many different forms. And fascinatingly, as he's revising the proofs of War and Peace, Tolstoy registers, which I think no one has noticed, this new treaty. He has his character, Prince Andrei, say that what I would do if I were in charge, this is the day before he's going to be mortally wounded at the Battle of Borodino, would be not to take prisoners, which would become one of the central commands of the humane law of war, that if someone asks for quarter, you have to give it to them. Instead, Prince Andrei suggests that he would just kill people in the field, even when they've surrendered or been disarmed. They talk of the laws of warfare, humanity, the wounded, and so forth. That's all rubbish. Now, this is an outrageous argument. It is definitely a critique of humane war, but it seems outrageous, and it is. But let's explore it a bit, because I think we have to let him evolve. What is his argument, or what is Prince Andrei's argument, since we should never, having taken English class, literature class, and mix up character and author? Well, it's essentially that the worse war is, the better off everyone will be. This is the remainder, or part of the remainder of Prince Andrei's speech. Not taking prisoners would make war less cruel. If there were none of this playing at generosity in warfare, we'd never go to war except for something facing certain death for. So the explicit thesis here seems to be, or it's really a hypothesis, that is that making war brutal will make it less frequent. And these arguments were common in this part of the 19th century. Actually, Karl von Clausewitz earlier flirts with them, and someone now famous named Franz, later Francis Lieber, a German, later American, who in this same moment wrote the first national code of conduct for an army, made a parallel version of this argument, except that he didn't insist that brutal war would be less frequent. He insisted that it would be shorter. But regardless, what we're dealing with is a kind of consequentialist argument. It relies on an empirical prediction about what will happen. And I think either way, those of us who know anything about the 20th century have to reject it. It seems absurd to suggest that making war more brutal would either make it less frequent or shorter. But let's be generous and try to imagine salvaging the argument, allowing it to sound in a consequentialist mode, and rely on a guess that might be more plausible. Namely, that making force more humane could facilitate the resort to it, which seems a bit different, more plausible to me as an empirical prediction, or facilitate reliance on force once it's initiated. More generally, you could say that Prince Andreis' better argument was or would have been that humanity can entrench a violent corporal practice. Now, again, it's consequentialist, it relies on an empirical prediction. You decide whether you think it's plausible or not. I'll argue later that we've lived through its realization, but that's for later. In this era, if we're in the business of talking about dubious empirical predictions, we should note that there was another empirical prediction that I think has also failed. And it was the prediction of a man who followed Dunant as the head of the Red Cross, and actually was the prime mover in it, named Gustave Moyn. His name is very similar to mine, but he's my nemesis and of no relation. He claims before his funders that if we make war more humane through the Geneva Convention of 1864, which he guarded jealously from revision, actually, we will bring peace. Men have concluded in the Geneva Convention that they ought to begin by showing some regard for one another's suffering, pending a time when a still stronger conviction of their common humanity shall lead them to understand that the very idea of killing one another in war is murder, is monstrous. That's actually all plausible because it's like a second best argument. This is a bad argument, I think, as an empirical prediction now. The humanization of war in his French La civilisation de la guerre could only end in its abolition. Well, it hasn't happened. And so if we're going to reject Prince Andreis' empirical prediction, I think we also ought to be very dubious about the claim that the good cause of making war humane will have side effects that make war less frequent or last less long. Actually, I'm putting this in just because I'm proud of finding it. It's not strictly relevant. But Moyn, at a certain point, foresees my parable. He imagines a time, this is in the 1890s, when his project could make war so humane, in his word, harmless, that war itself would become more and more tolerable. And he acknowledges that were that to happen, he would smash what he's devoted his life to achieving, more and more humane war. Well, in advance of that, and it may be relevant to the present, Tolstoy evolved. As you may know, he foresaw his conversion already as a soldier in the 1850s. And after he had now finished his second major novel, Anna Karenina, in the 1870s, he had a conversion experience. The ink was barely dry on that novel. And it actually was this work that followed from his conversion at this moment that made him world famous and led to the fact that we all read his earlier novels. But he became a hectoring moralist, and not least a pacifist. There had been earlier pacifists. Henry mentions that growing up in Virginia, he would run across Mennonites who, like Quakers, were part of that religious tradition. Tolstoy made up his own version of Christianity, so unusual, let's say, unorthodox, that it earned him excommunication from his own church. It was based almost purely on the Sermon on the Mount, and in particular this one line, Matthew 5:39. And through his interpretation of it, he had, I would venture to argue, far more titanic an impact on modern history than any philosopher, unless he was one, because it was in this work, notably in his book, The Kingdom of the God is Within Us, that the whole philosophy of nonviolence that we appreciate in Mohandas Gandhi and Martin Luther King flowed. Clearly, if you adopt a non-resistance ethic, you give up consequentialism. And yet we'll see that he is willing to work with his audience who hasn't had the revelation that he has. And what he tried to do, among all his other activities I want to show you, is to try to buttress and enrich this empirical conjecture that he's made in his earlier period, that it's possible that humanity could entrench warfare. And what he does is advance this this argument through a pair of fundamental analogies. They're analogies between war and other violent corporal practices, slavery on the one hand and slaughter on the other. And what he wants to do with those, I want to argue, is specify what agents are involved in the entrenchment of warfare when it's made more humane, and what mechanisms, including causal mechanisms. So let's start with his example of slavery. Tolstoy looks back. Actually, he uses slavery as a metaphor for everything bad and writes a book called The Slavery of Our Time, which is a kind of anarchist tract. But his analogy for war in particular, the violent corporal practice of war, is very specifically about the attempt in the early 19th century in your British Empire and my country once it broke away to ameliorate slavery. Most law involving slavery in the later 18th and early 19th century was called amelioration law, and its explicit goal was to create humane slavery. And Tolstoy's essential point is that looking back, given the possibilities of abolishing slavery, partially or totally, was a gross moral error. Why should the same not be true of war? And he adds that just as there was a risk that making slavery less cruel, not challenging slave owners' property rights, but limiting their use of it so that they had to treat their property less cruelly, could entrench the very practice it humanized. Now, I'm not a historian of this era, but one of the most famous, named Winthrop Jordan, actually insists that amelioration law had the causal effect of making slavery less open to challenge, more long-lived. Victories over brutality left the real enemy more entrenched, his word, than ever. As slavery became less brutal, there was less reason why it should be abolished. And Tolstoy's fundamental point is, what if we do the same thing with war why is humane slavery a gross moral error, but humane war a good thing to pursue? Well, in the course of this, Tolstoy gives what I think is a very interesting theory of kind of what kinds of agents could be involved. Let's call this causal pathway the advocate's compromise. What happens, he says, is that advocates who might have struggled for abolition give up that end as unavailable or too soon and make a compromise with those whose power they might have destroyed, the slave power. And they decide to agree, or at least not contest slavery itself, in exchange for urging their partners in dialogue and law to make the practice more humane. So you see where he was going with this. What if the ameliorator who made that strategic compromise is like the humanitarian when it comes to war, who could risk giving up or postponing his abolitionist end, at least with respect to a given war, if not all war, in the name of making what seems inevitable, at least for now, more humane? It's clearly in the interest of the slaveholder to make the deal. He gets to keep his property. But Tolstoy says, if it was a terrible mistake for that compromise to take place for slavery, why human slaughter? Now, I don't want to suggest that this is a knockdown argument, although I think it's pretty powerful. For one thing, we could entertain Moyn's hypothesis when it comes to slavery and contend that making slavery more humane will hasten the road to abolition. Or, I think even more interestingly, we could argue that in certain cases where it's impossible to challenge a practice, in particular in general, we can attack it indirectly through dramatizing its inhumanity. I'll come back to this, but I think the attack on torture in 2004 through 6 was an indirect anti-war politics. Some had a good moral reason. Everyone involved had a good first-order moral reason to attack torture, but they also deployed the attack on torture as a strategy when they could not, they thought, come out against the war, which they may have supported. Now, the response to these alternatives, I think, is obvious, that neither this idea that humanity could lead to abolition, nor this idea that it could powerfully work as an indirect strategy, may work. And in fact, making the practice more humane may, in the case of slavery, did. In the case of war, you decide, entrench the practice. Now, you could buy his attack on slavery and deny its use as an analogy. You might conclude that even though we thought slavery was inevitable, it turned out to be open to abolition. The same's not true of war. But his argument depends on your thinking that maybe there's not just a viable politics of opposing war instead of making it more humane, but that making it more humane could entrench war. So that's his first argument, and it's his first agent, the advocate, the person at the wedding who has worked for the non-governmental organization, and his first causal pathway, a compromise, a strategic choice to compromise. His second runs through a different analogy, the comparison of, let's call it, human to non-human slaughter. Actually, this surfaces already before his conversion in that same speech from Prince Andrei, where the prince continues that making war more humane and then going on to conduct it anyway, as at Sevastopol, is like the magnanimity and sensibility of the lady who turns sick at the sight of the calf. She's so kind-hearted she cannot see blood, but eats fricasseed veal with a very good appetite. Now, after his conversion, Tolstoy met an itinerant vegetarian named William Fry, who also insisted on giving up salt. And Tolstoy stopped eating animals. It was tough on his family, although his wife later agreed to help him put together one of the kind of most circulated vegetarian cookbooks of the era. But none of that is relevant. What is relevant is that after his conversion and his newfound vegetarianism, Tolstoy visits a slaughterhouse and writes a fascinating description of the slaughterhouse. He doesn't go to his local one near his aristocratic estate, but instead he goes to the bigger nearby town in order to see the new and improved system practiced there, whose purpose in the new slaughter technology of the late 19th century is to make animal slaughter more humane. Amazingly, or not, he uses the same analogy of the kind, refined lady who thinks she's a good person because she's pushed for humane slaughter and therefore can go on to continue eating animals with full assurance that she's doing right. Now, I just want to mention that this is very applicable to the way slaughter takes place today. This book I'm showing you by Timothy Pachirat is an ethnography of one of the few mass American slaughterhouses still operating there. And as a grad student, he posed as migrant labor to work there, and he did his dissertation on it, and it's basically a description. He emphasizes in this book how the kill floor, as it's still called non-euphemistically in a slaughterhouse, is segmented by walls. And he argues that you can create distance, not just between the downstream consumers of meat, but the local workers in the slaughterhouse and the killing by building walls. And he elaborates this analogy between faraway war that Americans fight, even though they think they're good people, and the walls in the slaughterhouse that, again, place distance even between local workers and the death. What I'd like to say is that he misses something in his own ethnographic reporting, which is that he describes a very similar scene as Tolstoy had 100 years before, in which there's animal slaughter that is now under law more humane. Amazingly, very few people are around for the actual killing of the animal, and it's dismembered very quickly, de-animalized in Pachirat's terms, so that no one ever sees their relationship to killing very clearly. And yet, on his own reporting, there are government workers in each of these mass slaughterhouses whose full-time job is to monitor, among other things, whether the cattle are treated humanely in the last moments before their deaths. And that's interesting, because it suggests that alongside distance, we care that the law makes slaughter in our name and for our sakes more humane, even when there's no one there or very few to see whether it is. Now, what is the agent and pathway here? Well, I think in this case, Tolstoy is trying to make a case about the audience or the beneficiary of violence. So, as I said, there's the advocate's compromise. Let's call this mechanism the beneficiary's bad faith. And the basic idea, I'm using the term bad faith, you call it what you want, is that if you do something good, you can think you're a better person or a good person, even though you remain implicated by choice in a much worse evil. And Tolstoy's claim is this is the function of making slaughter more humane. That for the audience or beneficiaries, now the guests at our transatlantic wedding, you feel better knowing that you are not complicit with brutality in killing, even when you go on to allow it to continue. Well, I'm not a moral philosopher in a room of many. This seems like a great indictment of a moral error, just all by itself. But it seems as if we should care about it if it turns out that this bad faith of the beneficiary has a relation to Tolstoy's empirical conjecture, namely that bad faith is another mechanism by which humane violence, if you'll accept that phrase, gets entrenched. Now, we could imagine the same alternatives to Tolstoy's empirical conjecture on this score. We could imagine that making the slaughterhouse humane will make it end more quickly. Or we could argue that in a world of meat eating, the best way to raise consciousness about the evils of eating meat is to dramatize the brutality and end it. Here, I think we're in position to say those are very implausible arguments. It seems as if Tolstoy has a very strong empirical conjecture that making slaughter more humane because of the bad faith of the beneficiaries could function not to end endless war against animals, but to entrench it. And you see where I'm going with this. Okay, so I need to turn towards a conclusion. Well, how does this all relate to war today? You might claim that Tolstoy erred in his skepticism towards suspicions about the project of making war more humane on the on the analogy of slavery and slaughter, because he's operating in the absence of any modern, especially treaty-based jus ad bellum, as we call it in the law, restraints on the resort to force. When war has no constraints on its outbreak or continuation, it might seem scary to solely pursue the attempt to make it more humane because it could have the effects he fears of entrenching it. And for that reason, he was part of a once very big peace movement, albeit a fringe element on it, that made morally conceivable 20th century constraints on the resort to force, including in the United Nations Charter. So maybe his argument, now that we do have some constraints on the resort to force, are less powerful. And we adopt the view that when war breaks out because it's just under the UN Charter or someone's moral philosophy, or there's an unjust war, we should have this other body of law, which at least makes what remains more humane. But I don't think that's the right answer, because I still think we're seeing, in some circumstances, the effects that Tolstoy worried about, humane entrenchment in the domain of war. So I don't want to get into detail, and this is all sort of stipulative, but we've been living in an era of erosion on the constraints we may have thought we had or wanted to make more binding at the end of the Cold War on the resort to force, especially amongst great powers. And in compensation, we do seem to have more advocate emphasis, more beneficiary or public concern, and more compliance with constraints on the conduct of hostilities. And it may be that these two facts are not unrelated. At least we ought to care that there might be humane entrenchment going on in our advocacy of more and more humane war. Now, I hasten to add, I'm not suggesting, I would never suggest that a great power war, my country's war, is either humane in its conduct or legal in its compliance with applicable standards as best interpreted. That's not my argument. But it is more humane than before, arguably. And it's more legalized as a matter of public argument, including when the military cares a lot about giving its own interpretation of what counts as humane war in order to live up to it, even if you think that's only because it cares about optics rather than ethics. So what are the lessons you might draw from Tolstoy that might be still applicable in his worries about humane war, even if you reject his pacifism, which I personally do? Well, it's wariness and consciousness of the risks that if we struggle narrowly to make war more humane under law, we need to contemplate the risk of entrenching it. And above all, focus on these two dynamics, which he's identified, and I'm sure there are others, of the advocate's compromise and the beneficiary's bad faith. And therefore that we never separate control of force from the companion concern with its humanization. Now, I don't want to get really contentious, but if we talked about what we lived through, especially in my country after 9/11, I think there would be very considerable evidence that Tolstoy's fears of humane entrenchment were realized. Sometimes with the best intentions, maybe because there was no alternative, but it happened. And that's because when we look back at the struggle over torture and more broadly over treatment of detainees, and even more recently in the primary optic on American war of denouncing collateral damage, we can worry that the advocate's compromise and the beneficiary's bad faith have been at work. Because what those campaigns were about in retrospect was removing, as you might call it in my analogy, which Tolstoy could not have used, the bug from the program of endless war. It's more humane, it's more legally compliant, at least more than it was before. And in these two crucial periods, in the years after the revelation of the Abu Ghraib atrocities in March 2004, and then after Barack Obama's election in 2008, when he pivoted from having run as an anti-war candidate to being an endless war president, we can worry that activist strategies and public acceptance were beautiful illustrations of the dynamics that Tolstoy had identified all those decades ago. Well, I'm probably running short on time, so I'll skip one thing and conclude with a couple of thoughts. I don't want to suggest that we don't need to save Tolstoy from himself and improve upon his thinking. It's just a starting point as the witness that he was for the attempt to make war more humane. I don't think he himself thought that violent corporal injury was the worst thing, but he focused on it. And you'll notice that his analogies all involve the evil of corporal violence. War is like slavery and slaughter. But that ignores that that's not what war's about. And we could end those evils and have war remain. and have then the central evil of war, which my parable is meant to evoke, namely domination, remain, especially in an atmosphere where powerful states can cross borders without pushback. Here I think we can find a disanalogy with the case of animal slaughter. There is no way of editing out the killing of the animal from the slaughterhouse. That's the purpose of it. What we seem to be finding today is that it is possible to edit violence out of war, at least to some extent. And once again, we have noble humanitarians who are pursuing this cause, which we could think of as converting war into policing, but are directed towards the soldiers because they are humans too. So in these examples of great causes, which you all have talked about in your deliberations, of the alleged duty under extant international humanitarian law, so-called, to capture rather than kill, or the more newfangled prospective notion of getting international human rights law, which provides a right to life to soldiers, to co-apply with international humanitarian law. We find attempts not to end war, but to make it more humane for soldiers and to experiment with editing the killing of enemies out of war. And that's not something that could in principle happen to animal slaughter. Of course, we can invent fake meat. But if that's so, I think we need to give much more attention to that branch of jus ad bellum, which I think in its very terms is much more not just about violence and suffering as the evils to control, but about domination. Now, we'll have a conference, I understand, about this tomorrow. I'm personally skeptical as of today that we ought to rethink jus ad bellum in the vein of human rights, because it seems as if its own textual basis is intended to protect political independence among other collective values of peoples. And that's an argument for non-domination in international law, not a reduction of suffering. Tolstoy did not see that. He couldn't have seen the possibility that his own focus on physical violence would make it hard for him to imagine my wedding and the humane control that's coming about in the history of warfare. Not totally, as one strand that may continue in the future. So I conclude with Henry. Obviously, fighting hurt is a noble thing. And he's taught us as much as anyone to continue with the dualistic default with which we generally work as moralists and lawyers. We locate when is there morally justifiable war and try to get the law to match. And then whether or not it's morally justifiable, we try to minimize its evils and hurtfulness when it breaks out. And I haven't said anything, I don't think Tolstoy has said anything, to me at least, that disturbs that basic set of assumptions. But there are these two minor provisos that I think he's offered and I've tried to revive. First, beware the entrenchment that leads the two parts of this dual agenda to be in tension sometimes under certain imaginable circumstances where making war humane could make a force more familiar and longer lasting in endless war. And second, strive to connect the law of war not just with fighting hurt, as noble as that agenda is, but also to fighting domination, including as it takes increasingly humane form. Thank you very much.
Professor Moyn has kindly agreed to take questions. I think there are some microphones around the room. So if you want to ask a question, please wait for the microphone. This is being recorded, and so your question won't be captured unless it's being recorded. So there's questions here. Sam, do you want to field the questions?
Professor Heller.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam, for a fantastic lecture. First off, I hope you mentioned the finest fictional representation of your argument, which is the Star Trek episode where the two sides, they've been fighting for hundreds of years. They don't remember why they're fighting. Right. They don't like the consequences of actual missiles, so they have computers simulate how many will die, and then everybody just kind of voluntarily steps into the suicide machine if the number comes up.
I'm not trying to interrupt you, although
That's
I am.
fine.
But
I do have a question.
I've been told about this by many people, and then I watched it, and there is that fact that you mentioned at the end that once they have the simulation, they still kill all the victims. Right. Okay, so that's not what happens at the wedding. Right. So it's trying, but it is definitely needs to be watched, and is widely streamable.
So my question is, I think actually kind of goes back to one of the slides that talked about indirect humanization. Okay. And I'm very sympathetic to your argument, but I wonder if it's possible to kind of rethink the humanization strategy, not as having anything to do with ethics, but completely having to do with economics, which is the point of making, as a vegetarian, the making of slaughtering animals more humane is not because we think that's a substitute for eliminating the killing of animals, but it makes it much harder to actually make a profit out of killing animals the more humane you make it. It's just, if you have to let your chickens run around, your profit margin goes down. Same thing with slavery, that nobody really wanted slavery to continue, but by making it more humane, if that was possible, it would raise the costs and from a capitalist standpoint make it no longer the kind of efficient value-added machine that it was. Right. And then is it not possible to think of IHL in the same way, that if in fact we could get states to comply with IHL, which of course we can't, it wouldn't be possible to fight effectively in the way that IHL demands, that it raises the costs too much to the point where it's not about, again, not about humanity, it's about the impossibility of fighting effectively. So might that not be some kind of hidden virtue of the humanization argument?
Sure. So, in these empirical predictions, I'm as insistent as anyone that, they're often contingent, and they may turn out differently depending on what further facts are introduced. Now, I don't know that anyone ever introduced international humanitarian law as branded as such in the 1960s for this reason, as part of an anti-war strategy that works by making war more costly. It may be that some do now. I think it is plausible that, those who campaign against animal slaughter think that it's a canny strategy to insist on humane controls in order to put companies out of business. Then we'd have to ask, well, is that a plausible strategy and did it work? Now, I think the limited evidence I have suggests not. It's like Moynier's idea. It's a different version of it, and it works through a somewhat different causal pathway, and it fails just as his hoped-for causal pathway does so far. Now, of course, we could always raise the threshold of what counts as, allowable in, humane slaughter or of non-human animals or humans in order to make it ever more costly, and we just haven't done so yet. And maybe that would work. And then it depends, what are the alternatives to that strategy? Are there any that are available to control force of either kind, but this sort of, blind guess that we might be able to conduct abolitionism indirectly? I would hope there would be some alternatives. And as you know, Kevin and I are writing this book about the Vietnam War, and I skipped it for time, but what is interesting about our period is that there was an anti-war movement in 1969 when My Lai was revealed, unlike in 2004, basically, when Abu Ghraib was revealed. And as a result, the one revelation threw accelerant on the fire of anti-war sentiment. And it worked very powerfully to make it something with political significance. Whereas in the case of the Abu Ghraib photos, again, very arguably and controversially, it functioned to edit out the bug of torture from the program of endless war, had the opposite effect. So it may be there are cases when, say in 2004, when an anti-war politics is unviable. I don't think it ever is. And we should rely on these indirect strategies. Just this one doesn't appeal to me just because it doesn't seem empirically plausible right now. Yes, sir. Yeah, go ahead, Chet Dallas. Yeah. I think you have to speak.
Well, I guess I have two questions. One is just a comment. It seemed as if, as you were talking, the Tolstoy / Moyn concerns you were raising sounded very similar to what Foucault says about the abolition of torture, and how, and that seemed to be explicit at the end. So I wondered if you'd talk about that, because Foucault says is that doing away with the blatant violence of it is just a way of getting more insidious domination. So the comment is that. But the second thing is just a clarification about what it means to normalize war or to entrench it. There might be one view which says that if we're comfortable that war is going to be waged morally, then we're more likely to use it as a first resort rather than a last resort, and that bears on the necessity condition. So that argument is that in a case where there could be a reason to go to war, we're more likely to do it rather than do an alternative. But there's another view which I actually think characterizes America today, which is that if you think the wars are being fought cleanly, you don't care at all about why America's fighting the war. You have no idea what we're doing in these places, because you just sort of feel, well, it doesn't matter if we have any reason at all, because whatever it is, we're doing it morally. Those are somewhat different claims. They could both be the case, but I wonder if you'd comment on that.
No, fantastic question. So it's occurred to me and others that this is kind of a Foucauldian argument. You know, he opens Discipline and Punish famously with a contrast of the drawing and quartering of a regicide with the humane control and discipline of people in prison, and he says things got worse. Now, I'm not exactly saying that. I don't think Tolstoy is saying exactly that. He's saying, let's be careful of the risk that obtains when we engage in the quite noble cause of diminishing cruelty in our practices. And I would think that's a much more responsible claim. I would be the last person who would want to draw and quarter people or to return to brutal war. And it's, you know, Foucault is famously silent on the normative basis of his arguments, but I'm hoping this is somewhat different because it's narrower and hopefully more responsible. And it also is trying to be more in touch with normative argument in a way that Foucault kind of famously found, you know, not his thing. Now, I'm not sure I totally got the second question. I mean, your two possibilities are familiar from the talk. I agree they're somewhat different. I'm not at all committed to the position that making war humane inevitably, or let alone always, incurs these risks. The two you identified, which do indeed operate quite differently for different people. The question is, are they operating either or both in the case at hand? And definitely the second is. I'd go that far. I know Adil had a hand. Monica, I don't want to.
Thank you very much.
Oh, sure. Someone else can choose.
For your presentation. Is it on? Yeah. My name's Michaela. I'm a BTL candidate here and studying international law and non-conflict.
Hi.
I had 3 thoughts and then a question. Thought 1, it seems a problem that with the word humane
Yes.
is that in it is the word human.
Yes.
Thought 2, it seems that it's human to fear, human to anticipate, human arguably to eat meat, human arguably to want to take revenge. Thought 3, elevating this to the humanitarian level, it seems that what is elemental to being human is inconsistent with the elementary considerations of humanity. So I wondered if it's plausible to question whether the problem with humanizing war is that it's up to humans to determine what is humane.
Okay. Well, those are really interesting questions. So, you know, I think you're making some very powerful points. I mean, it's offensive, actually, that we refer to atrocity in warfare and other contexts as brutality, i.e. being like animals, and that we would dare refer to making the slaughterhouse less hurtful for those dying as something humane. It's ridiculous. However, there's a historical basis to this, which is that reformers with very specific ends, some rather than others, decided to say, humanity's on my side. Now, of course, that's ridiculous for the reasons you point out. There's an NGO in the United States, maybe globally, I don't know, called Humanity in Action. And, you know, I had an undergrad, and I wrote a letter of recommendation for her to join it. And I just asked her as she was leaving my office, you know, whether, you know, Adolf Hitler was an example of humanity in action, because of course he was. He was a human doing things. What can it mean? I mean, so there is a problem that historically the concept of humanity has been arrogated for certain causes, and it's been actually being like an animal, non-human animal, has been applied to our worst conduct. Now, maybe there's a good reason for that. I mean, when I believe Jean Pictet, this Red Cross representative leader, decided to rebrand the laws of war, all of them, as international humanitarian laws, we now call it and teach it in all of our schools, he was attempting a branding exercise, but that engaged in this strategy. I think it's harmless. I mean, the question is, does it work? Is it morally virtuous? And does it achieve what it sets out to achieve? And all I've wanted to claim is that it's morally virtuous with risks that are very serious, and it doesn't work to address those risks in all cases. So call it what you like, especially for funders and interns and the like, and then do the right thing. So, I mean, I think you raised some really interesting questions.
Hi, Sam. Thank you for the talk. I thought it was super interesting. And I guess I wanted to ask you whether you could disentangle a little bit the claim that the thing that allows us to be more tolerant of war is that we're making it more humane, from the claim that the thing that allows us to be more tolerant of war is that it is highly legalized. Because, of course, in some ways those two overlap, but in some they don't. And
of course.
So I'm just wondering whether you can disentangle them and whether you anticipate disentangling them. And maybe my suggestion would be that you might try to a little bit in the project.
Great. No, that's so useful. Thank you. Clearly, their relation to one another is not necessary. I mean, you could imagine a more and more humanized practice that is not made more humane under law. And you could obviously imagine a legal practice or a practice that becomes more and more legalized, that it is not done so without the intent and definitely not the effect of making it more humane. I mean, one of the funny things is before the rebranding of international humanitarian law as international humanitarian law, it's very implausible, and maybe even today is implausible, to think of it as primarily a body of law intended to make war humane, let alone having that effect. There's great scholarship about the era I'm talking about, not so much about the Geneva Convention, but about later episodes done by Eyal Ben-Venisti and Dorian Lustig that basically says, wait, this didn't have the intent let alone the effect of making war more humane. It was about order. And that's why states agreed to go along with it. And maybe most of the extant law of war is not about humanity. So you're right, we need to disentangle. But my claim would be there have been advocates and beneficiaries for whom this law matters because its intent announced is to make war more humane. And that was why I kind of obsessed about Tolstoy and, the Red Cross. Now, I agree that this is a contingent relation, even in recent history. So if you take this argument I'm floating, and I haven't elaborated here, about what happened after 9/11 with the best of intentions, with activists outside the government and inside the government, making war more legal. I think on neither side do you find empirically the primary goal of making it more humane. If you take the case of someone like Michael Ratner, who was kind of the leading figure leading to cases like Rasool, he obviously thinks torture is an obscenity, but his main concern is to remember Magna Carta and make habeas available to all and so forth. And it's sort of not exactly happenstance that he ends up paving the way for Hamdan and the definition of global war as non-international armed conflict, et cetera, and having some humane content in the form of Common Article 3 apply. But that's the effect. Take the other side. This will be controversial, but someone like Jack Goldsmith, who tears up John Yu's torture memos and rewrites ones having to do with surveillance and so forth. His goal is not to make American war more humane. His goal is to legalize it and ensure its future legitimacy, and he does it. But part of that law is about humane war. And so it's very important that he, in the face of the Abu Ghraib revelation, tears up the torture memo and, so forth. So I want to respect your very important point that these aren't the same. Arguably, they overlapped in Tolstoy's time, and they do in ours. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Deal.
Hi, Sam. So going back to your parable, I noticed two things. First, that the wedding announcement was in the New York Times, and second, that... Sorry? So the wedding announcement in your parable was in the New York Times, and the dateline was 2014.
Yes.
So first, I wanted to know whether your thesis is primarily about the United States, whether it has anything to say about Russia or Syria or Saudi Arabia, who have been waging horrifically inhumane war, maybe not endlessly, but for several years now, without much restraint. And second, I wonder if it's a bit time-bound. So had I heard this talk in 2014 or maybe 2012, I would have thought, what Sam is explaining is how Barack Obama sleeps at night and how Samantha Power, Marty Lederman, Harold Koh go to cocktail parties and have a good laugh. But lots changed since then. The war in Iraq and Syria turned into urban warfare. We leveled entire cities, killed thousands of people. I don't think it changed much in American politics. I don't know that it changed much in Washington, D.C.
Fair.
The killing program, I don't even know how targeted it is, in Afghanistan has ramped up. We're killing more civilians. It barely makes the news. I wonder how you bring your thesis up to date to explain where we are now and what we've seen. And whether the causal mechanism is supposed to come from the American public or from the government itself, whether that mechanism really would have worked differently had the policies been different.
No, excellent. So let's say that if one did a ranked list of determinants of even American endless war today, the fact that it's been made more humane is not going to be high on the list, let alone the warfare of other states. So that's true. And if we really wanted to target the determinants of war, starting with the most important, this is not where we would start. Maybe the determinants are more obvious. This is, let's say, hopefully more original than the top of the laundry list. That this is on the laundry list, I think, is supposed to be, relatively startling. At least that it could be. It is definitely my response to those years of President Obama's works, and not just the conduct of his lawyers, but of advocates and lawyers who were all swept up into these dynamics. And it's really those people I want to address. Not so much lawyers, because as we found, lawyers are hired guns and there will be some to serve anyone. But there are advocates and beneficiaries who can learn from mistakes. And it's not implausible to me that this is a very important feature, at the very least, of some great power war making, including this country's, not just one, but its allies. Maybe even the allies in coalition impose more constraints in a humane direction than would have obtained. And, they're the people I care to reach. And I think I skipped this, but, my real trouble is when there's not a progressive movement that is embracing the anti-war cause and only embracing the humane war cause. You cede the possibility that someone like Donald Trump could run as and claim to govern as an endless war candidate. I think I skipped that, but there's his tweet, and it's been constant. Actually, this will be even more controversial than some things I've said, but I think Donald Trump has been constrained by the earlier choices of the Obama administration. It's not like he hasn't changed any of the policies, including just telling us what's going on. But arguably, the fundamental shift was at the end of the Bush administration, an American war, including drone warfare and increasing reliance on special forces, which I think I also skipped. But the drone empire in Africa is at the bottom, and under Obama you had 160, and now, sorry, is that the right number? Okay. It's roughly that number. No, 140, and now under Trump it's 150 countries in the world in which special forces operate. These are facts that I think have remained continuous in the move to kind of lighter, no footprint war. So I think it matters. I wouldn't. You're completely right to say that this isn't yet a generalized strategy beyond, let's say, liberal democracies, where there's the kind of advocacy and the kind of beneficiary dynamics that Tolstoy indicted. It could generalize, and it remains important. And so if it's on the list at all, it's worth talking about.
I'm so sorry. It's 7 o'clock, and we've run out of time. It just leaves me to say a huge thank you to Professor Samuel Moyn for coming to speak to us so clearly and so eloquently. Thank you very much for coming. And to conclude by thanking Henry as well for inspiring so many of us and for giving us the occasion to gather today and to listen to these thoughts. Thank you.